Done. Thank you, Paulo. Wow, that's amazing. We're having some fun with the music. Are you got Love Train on right now, guys? Let's go. Woohoo! World, join hands. Get on the love train. Love train, come on. All right. Oh my gosh. How are y'all doing this morning? Are you ready? You ready for a couple more? You feeling it? Let's hear it. Come on, let's hear it for all the speakers putting their heart and soul in it. Yeah. Yeah, this is amazing. So our next speaker is the author of The Seventh Property, Bitcoin and the Monetary Revolution. And I can't wait to introduce you guys to my Coloradan friend, Mr. Eric Yakes. Welcome Eric Yakes to the stage. Thanks, guys.
Is this working? Wow, I'm glad to see you guys. I missed the connecting flight last night and had a bunch of delays and ended up sleeping in the Mexico City airport. So we're on about 3 hours of sleep right now, and God really didn't want me to be here because I think it's because I'm talking about Bitcoin intermediation. So that said, I think that, I think this is a really important topic to be discussed. This is highly controversial. I think that this is one of the biggest questions in the industry that people need to be building a dialogue around and openly debating and discussing which direction this should go. I think that there's a variety of different solutions and a variety of different applications that are going to emerge in a variety of different ways. And we really need to start with thinking through what the theory is. So I think a lot of people at this conference are going to have a lot of practical discussions around some of these ideas. And it was around the middle of this summer when I started to notice that there was a lot of people in the community that were focusing on debating this idea, which is an area of research that I tend to focus on, and it's something that I think is really important we focus on over the next 5 years in terms of building out this ecosystem in the proper way. It starts with asking questions and really getting down to the basics and saying, what is credit? And, credit is any form of deferred payment. So I've put this chart over here on the right, and it might be a little harder for some of you to see in the back. But really what I'm trying to break down is the idea of, credit is likely to emerge on a Bitcoin standard in some form. And when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about this at the theoretical long-term, what does a Bitcoin standard look like? Some of these examples are very practical and applied to our current state of the industry. But when I'm talking about this breakdown, I'm talking about what would it look like if the world was on a global Bitcoin standard. So if we kind of look over at this left column, we have like the peer-to-peer economy. And credit can emerge through that avenue. It can also emerge through some form of intermediated economy, and that would effectively be like a credit intermediary, for example, who's taking Bitcoin and lending that Bitcoin directly. Or it could be like through a private media issuer, and that is these concepts of like fractional reserve banking. So an intermediary doesn't have to necessarily be fractional reserve. Does that mean that there isn't risk of insolvency? No. And it's actually kind of a challenging thing to really define what fractional reserve is. There's people who are lending notes beyond the amount of reserves that they have, or there's people who are simply mismatching the maturities of their liabilities. So they might take a loan out, lock it in for 3 or 4 years, and then anybody who's depositing within that company is allowed to withdraw on demand. So having that mismatch in maturities of your liabilities, that's something that can still trigger insolvency for a variety of reasons. So this is kind of, there's different types of credit that can emerge through different intermediaries as well as in a peer-to-peer system. There's also different types of risk that can emerge. So if we look, down in this lower half of the table on the default side, that's something that applies to everything. There's always that risk of any sort of credit that exists within the system. Maturity mismatching, asset mismatching, we've seen quite a bit of that recently. And, that applies specifically to an intermediated system and a system where we're issuing another form of money, whether or not that's Bitcoin. Lastly, the risk of bank runs and panics, and then ultimately some form of regulatory capture. That's something that would be significantly worse under a system that's fractional reserve by, a form of private media being issued. So what's important to understand about all this, I think, is, kind of this concept of like the entrepreneur's dilemma. As long as if we think forward, 50, 100 years, as long as entrepreneurs are forced with the dilemma of financing for when they have a project with the expectation that requires a capital outlay today, and they're expecting to meet a rate of return that's beyond whatever that capital outlay is, then they're going to finance that in some form. So the question is, well, will that be through credit? Will that be organically through savings? I think that there's strong arguments to make that on a Bitcoin standard, we're going to see a lot more savings, and where people are going to be financing things much more organically. But will it be completely that? Or will they turn more to equity financing? Do they need it to be all just credit? And there's also an argument that equity financing would be much stronger as well, and we'd probably have much more short-term forms of credit. But as long as there is a need to fix a liability as opposed to having a perpetual liability through equity financing, there will always be some form of demand for credit. So that's kind of at the high level. And how I'm going to break this down is looking at kind of like what a full reserve could potentially be and what a free banking system, kind of at the other end of the spectrum, excluding fiat central banking out of it, something that's purely through a private market. So to the point I was making earlier, looking at the same chart, we still have these risks within, if we were on a full reserve standard, and that means, we have some form of maturity mismatching risk still. The only way to eliminate that would be if all credit intermediaries were providing time deposit accounts and not demand deposit accounts. And so if they were just time deposit accounts, then sure, you could match the liabilities to your assets that you have in deposit. But nonetheless, we'll still probably see some of that in some form, even on a full reserve standard. That would be significantly less risky, which I'm going to get to later, than being on a fractional reserve system. Also, on a full reserve system, we could have algorithmically defined smart contract type systems, as well as just credit intermediaries where collateral is not even digital still. So that's going to be one of the other key distinctions, and something that's a topic of debate is the on-chain versus off-chain. If we have a lot of digitally native assets and liabilities, and there's a lot more information transparency we can garner from institutions, but if we have a lot of off-chain liabilities, that is still subject to real-world problems and verification costs, as well as having real-world assets and how that'll ultimately be represented through our digital system. Sorry, I think the clicker, oh, there we go. Yeah, it's kind of delayed. Okay, so for the next slide, once it goes, there we go. So there's kind of this idea of, will we see some type of fractional reserve emerge on a Bitcoin standard? And I think, the best way to think about this is, kind of starting at the beginning. And, credit is the oldest form of money. So before we had primitive commodity-based type monies, people had delayed reciprocal altruism. That's what Nick Szabo described it as in his paper Shelling Out. And that's what it was. We had to trust that if you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And that's why trust didn't scale very well, and it existed within community networks. It was once we had this invention of commodity forms of money and all these primitive forms that we were able to scale trust outside of our networks, because we eliminated trust from transactions. Rather than having to trust you would repay a favor to me, you can pay me money. So credit is this very old form of money, and it's a method of transaction that requires a lot more trust. And then once we evolved to commodity money, we could scale not only the level of trust, but that allowed us to build larger communities and societies because of it. So once we had this really good form of money with commodity money, the question was, well, why was paper money created? And it's because it was much more efficient than these commodity forms of money. It was more portable, it was more divisible, it was more fungible. Once we had inventions like the printing press or the telegraph and double-entry bookkeeping accounting, paper was moving money all over Europe much more efficiently than lugging gold around would ever do. So that enabled a system of fractional reserve, and how fractional reserve systems, typically emerge is when you are trusting some sort of note or some sort of derivative receipt instead of the underlying commodity. And throughout history, we had good reason to do that. It enabled quite a bit of efficiency. The problem with paper was that it lacked the property of scarcity. So we had to tie it to something that did. And that's why paper needed to be backed by something. Gold never needed to be backed by anything. It was scarce already. So that's kind of the idea. Is the key step for fractional reserve systems to emerge first is when we have a system of note issuance emerge. And then once that occurs, then it's possible for people to ultimately trust that receipt rather than the underlying commodity. And then the institutions that are in charge of that can start to lower the level of reserves that they ultimately have. So, well, I think it skipped over the last slide. But on the slide before this, there's a famous quote from Hal Finney on BitcoinTalk.org. And he talks about how he, reading into George Selgin's theory on free banking, believed that a system of free banking, which could be fractional reserve or it could be full reserve, it would depend on what the market ultimately demanded, was the best way to scale Bitcoin. And it was his long-term vision as to how Bitcoin would exist as a reserve asset, with various different banks all issuing their own form of paper receipts on top of it, competing in a private market for, some trading at a discount, some might even trade at a premium, and we're determining which form of money is more valuable. So now that we have the Lightning Network, has that really innovated away the need for that type of model? If we can conduct payments just as efficiently without having to trust in a receipt, but actual physical settlement of the underlying commodity, have we innovated away the need for receipts, which is a very key question. So why else would we want to have a free banking system, or better yet, why else would there be an incentive for it to emerge? I think there's kind of two primary ways that I've uncovered in some of my research. I think the first is privacy. We're witnessing technologies emerge where we're starting to see that trusting in a derivative receipt of Bitcoin enables privacy in a very significant way. Now, when we think about protocols like, for example, Fedimint that's emerging, and companies like Fedi, there's no plans necessarily for anybody to implement a fractional reserve system. But what matters is that it's an open source protocol, and people can build what they want. And will that occur? Will there ultimately be an incentive for that to exist? We don't doubt that the financial institutions themselves will have that incentive. Any fractional reserve bank earns money through seigniorage. They can lend money where they don't have to pay a depositor for it. They just create it out of thin air. So of course an intermediary wants that to occur. The question is it a persistent and sustainable system? Which means, is there real productive economic activity that ultimately emerges from it? And I think a good way to conceptualize this is to say, well, if we have one economy that doesn't have any credit, and then we have another economy that does, what economic projects were created within that economy that does, that ultimately created greater wealth and rewarded people for taking on that credit? And that's kind of the underlying incentive. So getting to it on another slide, we're going to dig a little bit more into that topic. But the free banking system is a world of competitive note issuance. There's not a lot of examples throughout history where it truly existed. It requires information transparency, it requires competition, and it requires minimal regulation. Very few systems that actually had minimal regulation. Like the US is a commonly cited example of free banking. Highly regulated, not a good system, didn't work out well because of it. The collateral that underlying banks were using was regulated, and they weren't even able to determine that. So it's something that I think is possible, and Bitcoin enables it in a lot of different ways, and there's a lot of advantages to a system like that emerging on Bitcoin. If we go to some of the Austrians, some Austrians were against it. Some believed it was kind of a utopian vision, but it would ultimately lead to some form of regulatory capture, which is a totally, if you look at systems throughout history, that's where it always led, because governments generate revenue through central banking. Of course, they're not going to let a private system like this flourish for long if they have the ability to control it. So that's the innovation of Bitcoin. So the question is if Bitcoin does have the permissionless properties that ultimately will enable such a system to emerge, will private market systems choose that? Will it ultimately create more economic wealth for society? And if it does, and many who are against fractional reserve banking, should we have intervention with the use of violence from some sort of authority to prevent a system like that from emerging? And I'm on the side that I don't think we should. I think that the market should be determining that, and if it is providing real world value, then that's something really important. Do I need to point at something? There we go. Sorry. So, why isn't this working? Hey, I don't know what's going on with this clicker. Sorry, guys. Okay. Guys, could you manually go back to one of the slides for me? Could you go to the one before that? Okay, perfect. Okay, yeah, so jump into the next one. So one thing I want to do, I think this is skipping over slides, but one thing I want to do is kind of describe, how free banking systems ultimately emerge. So like historically they would emerge, back to that original point, we have trust in some sort of derivative receipt that emerges, and then we have institutions that specialize in that. And then once that trust is enabled, then, it's like a full reserve system will be the initial expansion. And reserves will be kept there for a while once people trust in that receipt. Then these systems typically would turn to a fractional type system. Now, what made a lot of these sustainable, and a good example of this is like the Scottish free banking system. It's probably the most frequently cited. There's about a total of like 60 different observations of free banking. Most of them aren't really true to the theory of free banking. There's kind of like 5 or 6 that kind of fall into that category. And then the Scottish system in Canada are kind of the highest. So on the Scottish system, it lasted for about a century, and there was a period where, there was about 19 total bank failures over that period, and within that system, it was considered to be, very sustainable over time. That's actually a very small amount for something that was completely private with no central bank. So when that would emerge, it was because of a few things that ultimately kept this system in check. And the key thing to understand is that this was a system that ultimately had credit limited within it. So once people accept all the notes and those start to get widely accepted and traded, and there's various banks competing against one another, you trust Bank A, you don't trust Bank B as much. Once that system occurs, that's all an expansion of credit as they get more fractional. So that's expanding the money supply. But eventually it reaches a plateau. And that plateau is achieved typically because you have solvency speculators, which in these systems was typically like a competitor. This could be somewhat analogous to what we saw Binance doing over the past week. And then there's the primary economic incentive is called the principle of adverse clearings, and that basically means that if you are an institution extending credit in order to gain market share above your other competitors, then you are more at risk now of more redemptions. And the other banks who are receiving your notes, the greater supply of them in circulation, there's a greater likelihood that they're redeeming them and taking your reserves and benefiting them. So it actually benefits the more conservative banks while hurts the more credit extensive banks. So when we see that phenomenon, we'd actually witness that a lot of these systems would kind of find a market equilibrium level of credit that they would be issuing through these fractional reserve systems. Relatively sustainable. When there's no lender of last resort, that is one of the key, that is the key ingredient in why these types of systems were fundamentally different from a fiat system. So going into that, I think the key thing is that these systems are limited by the speculation of solvency among these banks. And when we consider like a full reserve system, those systems are limited by the amount of reserves that they have. So that's a key piece to understand. During the Scottish free banking period, there was a total of 19 bank failures, and about £32,000 was lost to depositors over that period. What does that mean? Well, it means that depositors typically were not left with the bag. If we think about how long that period was, it's a very small amount, but it means that typically a competitor buys the other bank or the equity holders lose out in some form. But nonetheless, it is a loss, and defaults are subject to any sort of market-based system. Okay, I think we're right here. So with all that in mind, in understanding free banking, I have a research piece on my website that I've written extensively. If you're interested in these topics, I would check it out. But this is just kind of a high-level discussion. But to kind of round a lot of this out, when we think about credit, fundamentally, what is the purpose of credit? And we can compare that to money itself. So if money allows us to spend value we've created in the past today in the present, then credit allows us to spend value we expect to create in the future in the present. So it's kind of the opposite of money. Now, you'll hear this topic of like the demand for money and how that exists. And, that's kind of a flawed form of thinking. And, the Austrian answer is there isn't demand for money, there's demand for assets. And money is something that just always exists in the savings of one person or another, and it's constantly being shifted around. When you hear terms like there is, a lot of money on the sidelines right now, it doesn't make any sense. There's always money on the sidelines. But so the key distinction that I think a lot of people are getting at when they say this is that there is demand between commodity forms of money and credit money. There's a relative balance of that. And credit fluctuates with society's expectations of the future. And as our expectations are higher, we finance more projects with those expectations in mind. And that increases the proportion of credit in the economy. So when we're really thinking about this question of, what will credit look like on a Bitcoin standard, it's more important to really answer the question of what type of credits are going to emerge and why. And I think that, number one, credit's determined by our future expectations, like kind of society as a whole in the aggregate, which is affected by quite a bit of things. And number two, depending on the type of system that emerges, some are more limited than others. So I have this table over here on the right. And this is kind of like a high-level view of how I think it looks, but in a peer-to-peer based economy, credit is kind of limited by the extent of the community network, how much trust exists within the person that you know closely in which you would be lending peer-to-peer. Now, if we had a full reserve type system of intermediaries, then it's limited by the amount of reserves that exist within that system. It's once we get to this concept of fiduciary media, which is another way of saying a fractional reserve type system where we have banks issuing media, fiduciaries issuing it, the credit extension is ultimately limited by the solvency of all the banks in that system. Going back to how a free banking system is regulated, it's regulated by banks going bankrupt from extending too much credit. And lastly, when we compare this to fiat, fiat is limited by political regime change. And as we've seen in the cycle throughout history, when we have a fiat central banking system, eventually they expand credit far beyond until they uplift their economies and it crashes and revolutions occur from it. So when we're making, when you ask the question of, what type of credit is going to emerge on a Bitcoin standard, I think that when I think about whether or not fractional reserve should exist, I don't thus far see many advantages to it that don't already exist in a system where we can have credit that's not a part of money. So being fiduciary media where credit is a part of money versus being some form of credit that's just issued outside of money and our money supply stays constant. Both are expansionary in different ways, but there's a difference between how that credit ultimately enters the system, like how today all of our money is credit now. I think the only advantage I can really synthesize out of it is that So the ease of credit extension in a peer-to-peer economy is a lot more challenging. People don't specialize in that. So it's a lot harder for them to extend credit. They don't have the resources, they may not have contracts, they may not have the specialties to assess credit risk. They just have access to greater information transparency from people within their community networks, which makes it advantageous. But the ease of extending is harder, so we have intermediaries that will specialize in it. And when those intermediaries specialize, that's when it gets a little bit easier to be doing that, but its value is trusted to an intermediary. When we think about a media issuer of credit and what the advantage over just an intermediated system would be, I really think it's kind of comparable to like an IPO versus already having secondary market trading for your stock. It's a lot harder to have to raise equity by going through an IPO and hiring a banker and SEC registration and hiring lawyers. Whereas if you already have a treasury account where you can go float some stock into the market, you can get it out there much more quickly and raise financing through that. So I think that that's kind of a way to think about what makes fiduciary media a little bit easier for the system. But the question then becomes, well, is that worth having a fractionally reserve-backed system? And I think not. But nonetheless, if this goes, I don't know what's going on with this file. Well, anyways, I will, I'll just tie this all out. So I think that, when we consider all of these advantages, I think the question kind of becomes, okay, so like, what will this system look like on Bitcoin? And I think it's going to be pretty fundamentally different. And I say that because we're going to have some of the qualities of probably both systems. The key question is going to be, if we have this note issuance that's persistent over time, right now we obviously see fractional reserve in the system, but in a peer-to-peer economy that's on a full global Bitcoin standard, will we be able to have those systems persist? I think that it'll emerge because of concepts like privacy or the economic benefits of that. And, but I also think that a full reserve standard, Bitcoin with Lightning solves so many problems that it's going to be very hard for a full reserve standard or for a fractional reserve standard to ultimately exist, because it's going to have to compete with this highly efficient form of full reserves. So if any of you have read, it was in around 2018, Nick Bhatia kind of proposed that we have this new instantiation of capital markets that's emerging on top of the Lightning Network. If you are setting up a routing node and you're connected to a variety of different peers and you're earning fees from routing and liquidity leasing, that's a new kind of like risk-free interest rate. Now, I don't like that word because it's a misnomer. There's no such thing as risk-free, and that process is not risk-free, but it's somewhat comparable to the idea in our traditional finance system. And this is kind of like this new form of capital markets that's emerging on top of the Lightning Network. That basically means that it's possible that we could see intermediaries exist, similar to what River Financial is doing today, is just node operators, and that'll be effectively like a bank earning kind of like this minimum rate of return on a Bitcoin position by just routing and liquidity leasing and running a very large Lightning node. So that's interesting. Like if that is a fully functioning business model that you can perpetually, capture the right amount of profits you want, then any sort of credit intermediary in and of itself, because that's not even credit, any sort of credit intermediary that's taking on a form of counterparty risk is going to have to compete with that business model, and a lot of people will probably depart from that. So it's making the idea of a full reserve a lot more competitive. But I think that there's also potential advantages that could emerge from a free banking type system and how much more efficient it's going to be. That being said, where I currently come out on a lot of this is we will have these highly efficient competitive systems for full reserve, and likely a fractional reserve system. It's going to have so much efficiency within this new type of system that it's probably going to be very challenging to sustainably maintain a fractional reserve bank. And what I'm saying is that, we're going to have things like, because capital mobility is a lot higher and information transparency is much greater, and we have certain new innovations like flash loans that emerged on the Aave protocol. Those types of concepts existing on a Bitcoin standard will make it incredibly hard to actually run a fractional reserve institution. So going back to what I was stating earlier around what kept these free banking systems credit in check, solvency speculation was a huge piece of that. And I think it's highly likely that if we do see some form of digitally native fractional reserve type banks, it's going to be incredibly easy for people to say, okay, I'm going to take a short position on your bank, and then I'm going to take out a flash loan that scales the liquidity of an entire liquidity pool, and I'm going to buy up all your notes out of the market, redeem them all immediately, pay off the flash loan, and then win on my short because you're completely out of reserves. So I think that there's going to be a lot of examples of things like that that start to emerge, and that's probably going to be a very primary limitation on whether or not we see it. That being said, I think what's most interesting is that, when we see the world on a Bitcoin standard, for the first time, we're actually going to be able to test some of these theories because we're going to have this very efficient and informationally transparent market. So this whole idea of whether or not some of these like Keynesian economic arguments that fiduciary media enables this greater extension of credit in an economy that reduces the degree of business cycle fluctuations, that's good. We're actually going to be able to witness whether or not some of these things are even true. And that's the benefit of keeping free and open markets. So to round this all out, I think that this is an incredibly important question to start discussing. I've been digging into a lot of the theory as well as practical considerations around this. And I encourage everybody in the community to read a bit more about this. This topic is obviously becoming a lot more salient in the past few weeks, and it will probably continue to be so. And if we build this all out in the right way, and that's probably going to come in a variety of different forms, but the goal is to build out the peer-to-peer economy as best as we possibly can and let intermediaries kind of bridge that gap to get us to the future. Nonetheless, I believe a full reserve standard is highly possible, and there's a lot of limitations for fractional reserve, but I don't claim to be certain of that notion. And yeah, I think I'm out of time.
Woohoo.
Do I have time for questions?
Come on over, baby. Give me a big old hug. Way to go. Yeah, everybody. Woohoo! One more time, we're going to celebrate. Gonna celebrate. All right.